Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Regenerative Agriculture panel. Thanks for joining us. We've got a great lineup this afternoon with deep expertise in the topic. So I'm Jenny Henman. I'm founder and chairman of Plant Your Future, which is a non-profit charity working in the Peruvian Amazon on regenerative agriculture with smallholder farmers. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. We start with you, Will, and then move along.
Hi, everybody. I'm Will Close-Brooks, director at Respira. I spoke this morning. We, as an investor, run a diversified portfolio, and we believe in the necessity or value of carbon finance to the regenerative space. So we have some soil organic carbon projects in our portfolio, both in grassland management and in the UK, supporting transition to regenerative, which I'll talk more about.
Great. My name's Nicholas Moss. So I'm the managing director of the Agri3 Fund. So Agri3 is an initiative established initially by Rabobank and UNEP with partners such as FMO. So I apologize a little bit. We may repeat a few things that Kim has already mentioned, but we are an independent company of Rabobank, set up as a blended finance vehicle, really to look at mobilizing capital from banks and other financial institutions into projects that support regenerative and forest conservation projects and businesses globally. We focus on middle and lower income countries. And the main way in which we work is we work through the provision of de-risking instruments. So we're quite unique in not being necessarily a direct liquidity provider to those projects, but really working with and through financial institutions in order to mobilize those pools of capital that exist there by providing de-risking instruments like guarantees to overcome certain aspects of regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, forest conservation projects that maybe fall outside the risk appetite of a bank, whether that be tenors, exposures, portfolios. So we're really aiming to mobilize capital from the financial sector into projects that we think are within our mandate. We really aim to do that globally, but we're mostly focused on some of the more emerging market countries such as Brazil, Indonesia, East Africa.
Simi.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Simi Thambi. I'm the climate economist at Fairr Initiative. Fairr is a large investor network working in the area of sustainable food systems. There are 370 members. The total AUM of our members is 70 trillion. A little bit about me. I joined Fairr only a couple of years ago. Prior to that, I worked with the Government of India and the United Nations Development Programme, mainly with the Office of the Prime Minister, as well as the Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. So I worked on a lot of projects on organic farming and agroforestry all across India, and also supporting the use of data and science and integrating it into the planning of the country. And now I'm at Fairr, which is, of course, a large investor network. So I'm looking at the same issues from the other side of the coin, which is quite exciting.
Great. Hello, everybody. Great to be here again this year, and lovely to see so many of you in the room for this panel and the end of the day. I'm Dr. Helen Crowley. I'm a managing director with Pollination. Pollination is a specialist climate and nature advisory and investment company. We're global, quite young, but work across the sectors, public, private, investment, corporate, landholders, helping them transition to net zero and nature positive, whatever that looks like for those particular sectors and for those particular clients. We also have an investment side of the business, and we have invested in Delta Blue Carbon, which is one of the largest mangrove restoration projects in the world, so a nature-based solution investment, and we have other investments off our balance sheet, and we also have a joint venture with HSBC called Climate Asset Management, which is investing in agriculture, forestry, nature-based solutions for climate and carbon, as well as biodiversity outcomes. So that's the pollination piece. I come at this as a pollination person, literally and metaphorically, but also as an ecologist by training, who's worked a lot in Africa with smallholder producers. And I spent a decade with Caring, the global luxury company, working on their supply chains and sustainability. And that is where really got into looking at how regenerative fiber production can really address climate and nature goals and ambitions at the corporate level, as well as obviously for the livelihoods and the farmers themselves. So I'm drawing on those three different sort of phases of my career, if you like, in this discussion today, as we really sort of talk about what it's going to take to make regenerative agriculture way more mainstream than it currently is. Thanks, Jenny.
Excellent. Thank you for those introductions. Well, yes, regenerative agriculture is a hugely exciting theme with a lot of potential to be scaled up. It's obviously very important in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions and its mitigation potential, but also for the broader environmental benefits that transitioning to that approach could bring. The first question or point we'd like to discuss as a panel is just what regenerative agriculture means. It's actually quite a broad term, and I've asked the panel to not only give their thoughts on the definition, but also all of them have got experience working in regenerative agriculture. So just to give some illustrative examples of regenerative agriculture programs they're involved in. We're going to kick off with Nick.
Yeah, so I mean, talking to a very educated audience, obviously, at its core, the way that we look at regenerative agriculture for us is, firstly, obviously, there's the soil carbon element, but it always has to be much more than that. It has to be about the broader ecosystem services that surround a farm site, and it has to be about the biodiversity conservation elements as well. So I think if you were to go to the minimum, you would say, right, it's really about soil organic matter, but of course, bringing about a more holistic system on a farm is really what we would want to see when we're talking about regenerative agriculture. The tricky thing, of course, when we have that definition is that features as more of an outcome. What we really then are challenged by is what are the underlying activities that we're going to do to deliver on that outcome. And the underlying activities that I think where we probably all have a bit of a challenge in doing, because whether we're talking about a small-scale farmer in East Africa or a really large-scale farmer in Brazil, they're going to be very, very different types of interventions, different technologies, different approaches, different even standards that go with it as well. And that's probably where a little bit of the disparity comes in the sector, because we use regenerative agriculture quite, we sort of throw it out as a bit of a term as well. So for us, the way we approach it is really to look at things in a context, on a case-by-case, but also in a broader landscape that we're working in. So, for example, we work quite a bit in Brazil, sometimes with medium and to larger farmers, and there we'll be looking at, what is, as a baseline, as already indicated by Kim, a quite sophisticated farmer. And what they're often looking for is options in order to improve capital investments, to improve technologies they're using, to actually then be able to improve the sites surrounding their farms, including the riparian areas that they're working on. So in that context, that's how we would define regen ag. That's really looking at soil, but also broader ecosystem services. And then we also have certain projects we're looking at, say, in East Africa, where we have to take a very, very different approach. And there we might be looking at more smallholder farmers. And of course, that comes down to, more conservation-focused aspects of what they're doing, such as, really working with them on the no-till side, for example. That might be somewhere we're looking. So first of all, regen ag, very important to think about the outcome, but the underlying activities and defining them within a certain landscape and context is what I think we should probably discuss a little bit on the panel as well.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Simi, I know you've worked recently on looking at issues to do with livestock in agriculture. I don't know if you want to follow on, perhaps with some broader reflections on what regenerative agriculture is for you, as well as maybe sharing some of your insights from the livestock sector.
Sure. So I'm a strong believer in the power of data to give insights, and that's why I'm going to use some numbers to maybe tell you a little bit about the livestock sector. So we looked at 75 big companies that work in the agri-food sector. The total revenue of them is almost maybe 1/3 of the total revenue from that sector. That's 9 trillion. And we looked at how do these companies define regenerative agriculture through their various annual reports. And we found that while there is some degree of clarity, there's also some degree of ambiguity. Almost 25 companies, do not clearly know what regen agriculture is. Now, the point that I want to make is, most of them define regen agriculture around 6 core components, and this relates to one of the questions that was asked yesterday. Now, those 6 components are 1, carbon sequestration, 2, biodiversity improvements, 3, water, 4, farm productivity and farmers' income improvements, and then there is soil health, as mentioned. So those are the 6 core elements around which these biggest 75 agri-food companies think of in terms of regen agriculture. But again, as I mentioned, 20 of them do not really define regen ag around any of these 6 elements. So that shows the level of ambiguity around this term.
Okay, thank you. Helen, yeah, it'd be great to hear from you on your reflections on what it means, and also perhaps you can share a few of your, go into a bit more detail on your examples from even the fashion industry and their work with fibre.
Sure. I think we've touched on the 2 really key parts of regen ag. I want to build on that a little bit. I think the ambiguity, the fact that it's starting to be quite a well-used term, if not a mainstream practice yet, is not necessarily a bad thing. It's come quite fast. I would say it's only the last 3 or 4 years that we're really hearing about it a lot more. To be clear, a lot of regenerative agriculture are traditional practices that have been around for many, many centuries, or if not millennia. So, particularly by traditional farmers and so on, and indigenous peoples. So, but for us in this sort of world, it is quite a recent phenomenon in terms of understanding what is this going to do for us, for climate, for biodiversity outcomes, for livelihoods, and importantly for resilience. So the fact that there's a bit of ambiguity, it's normal in the early days. I think we do have to get very, very clear, very fast on to what Nick was saying, the outcomes. What are the outcomes we want? And underlying that in each context, as he said, what are the specific things that you do to get those outcomes? So, for example, in the fashion supply chains that I worked in, what you would do with nomadic, how you would support nomadic herders in Mongolia, in that sort of really brittle, cold desert environment, in terms of how you do regenerative grazing, which is something that they did for centuries, and how you bring that back in the face of climate change and degradation of those landscapes, is very different to perhaps what you would do with smallholder producers in India growing cotton. But the principles underlying all that, as Nick said, are the same. It's bringing back ecological functionality in the soil, in the water, with and above ground as well, with the biodiversity on the land as well, the wildlife and flora as well. So again, this idea of the practice is important to be locally specific, but that the outcome, we can agree what the outcomes need to be. And it's really important to do that, because you have to have a holistic approach. You can't just focus on one outcome, just soil, or just carbon. You can't do that, and we won't get that system working, because regenerative is based on ecological principles. The whole point of going regenerative is to bring back functionality of those grasslands, or those systems that should be functioning with animals on, with animals perhaps not on in some of the other systems, but bring back that functionality so it is much more resilient and robust.
Thank you, Helen. Will, I know you're working on some regenerative agriculture projects closer to home. Perhaps you could share some experiences from
I mean, I think I can give some concrete examples of what we've seen in projects, which picks up on what the rest of the panel have said. I mean, ultimately for me, it's about moving away from extractive models to using nature. And I think securing that triple win of carbon sequestration, improved soil health, and deeper, richer biodiversity. So, as I mentioned, we've worked over the last 2 to 3 years with a farm in the UK, up in Leicestershire, based on heavy clay soils. It's around 1,000 acres, and they're relatively far along their journey towards regenerative. But what they've done in terms of investing into regenerative techniques brings this to life. So firstly, they have pursued a minimum disturbance regime, so they've moved away from tilling and ploughing, and that's had improvements in terms of reduced compaction of the soil. In essence, they've moved away from ploughing to using worms, so the worm count has gone up 7-fold in that time, and that is a natural way to improve your soil structure, benefits in terms of nutrient carry within the soil, and drainage. Another example is putting a permanent cover crop down. So they've planted, and again, this was material investment, they planted white-leaf clover as a permanent cover crop, and then they direct drill the cash crop through it. So they've had to invest into equipment. But actually, if you go and visit the farm in the winter, as I went up in February, and that clover is giving structure to the soil, when you would expect it to be very heavy and waterlogged, it's bringing that structure and at the same time fixing nitrogen. So using that permanent cover crop instead of expensive nitrogen and fertilizer inputs. They've experimented with habitat banking, so they've created strips in the field to create habitat for predators, so reducing pesticide input. I should say they've reduced their fertilizer consumption by about 25% as a result of the combination of crop rotations and companion crops and cover crops. And lastly, I think one of you mentioned it already, they actively introduced livestock into the rotation. So again, they had to invest in winter housing. They've got a dairy herd and some sheep, and that has the impact of improving soil biology. So in all those instances, you've moved away from external inputs that has a footprint associated with it to leveraging and utilizing nature on the farm.
So I'm sure no one is left in any doubt after those opening comments from the full panelists that regenerative agriculture brings many benefits, and no doubt we'd all like to see that adopted more broadly because of those benefits it will bring. However, mainstream agriculture is continuing, and there is a risk, I think, that business as usual in the agriculture sector continues to dominate. Simi, perhaps you could start us off with, I know you've been looking at this as well in the livestock sector, so it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that. And, are we starting to see transition, or are people just, a lot of the established agricultural business sticking with what they know?
So this year we launched a new tool called the Climate Risk Tool, which looks at the impact of climate change under different scenarios of warming on 40 of the largest livestock companies. So at the heart of the model is a very sophisticated land use model, which looks at how water scarcity and different temperature will impact the crop yields, as well as livestock in different regions of the world. And we integrate that with company level information of these 40 companies, the revenue and costs, to understand how it will impact the profitability. And the result was we found that if the world were to reach 2 degrees or exceed 2 degrees, 50 to 60% of the companies would, those big livestock companies would be operating at a loss by 2030. And in monetary terms, that will be around 24.7 billion. And this was reported in Bloomberg as well. So it's the business as usual scenario would be, would result in large losses. And then we looked at what are the biggest drivers of these losses for these companies, and we found that one of the key driver is feed-related costs, which are expected to increase significantly for several pork and poultry producers. In particular, North America, we found, would be significantly affected. So there were several interesting results which came up. Those who are aware of physical and transition risks recommended by the NGFS, we closely aligned our scenarios to those scenarios, and these scenarios and results are very much aligned to the ongoing discussions within the investment community.
Thank you. Will, you talked of the project you've been working on in Leicestershire. How do you feel that we can scale those projects more broadly across the country? What are the barriers to that? How can they become economically and environmentally viable, this kind of regenerative approach?
Yeah, I think where we see the real value of carbon finance is bridging. Two things. One is the capex I just talked about, investing into physical infrastructure in order to have livestock, capex for the direct drilling, things like that, and the farmer's going on risk for that, and there's an actual sort of financial liability which they're incurring up front. The second is this perception of reduced yields and how quickly that sort of balance corrects. So moving away from a model where you're pursuing yield towards one that's driven by margin. So, whether that's, it varies case by case, but whether that's, a shorter term gap or whether it's sort of 3 to 4 years, we think that's where carbon finance can really come in. So what we're trying to do as a business is to give that price signal Broadly, what we've done in the UK is to set a floor price similar to other UK natural capital assets, so woodland and peatland credits. I think in terms of the specific scale, it's really challenging because that's 1,000 acres. And if we go over to the US, which is where we're looking to do our next projects, on one farm we're at 15,000 acres. And it's very difficult to aggregate farms that have all got different specifics. And actually what we did in the UK was very specific in terms of monetizing net sequestration. So we ignored, or we discounted from the amount of carbon that had been gained in the soil, all the on-farm emissions, and we only included the farmed arable area. I think if you look across the UK and other farms that are farming, you've got livestock or poultry, it's very difficult to be in a position of just monetizing your net sequestration because you've still got a significant footprint. And I do think we need effectively the government to come in and support with development of a code, and then it's how private finance sits alongside public finance, because at the moment the ag sector is facing a lot of uncertainties in terms of transition post-Brexit. So again, the signalling impact of the carbon payments we've made and the contract we agreed with this farmer, it's actually made it economic to pursue that transition, even though they're losing the basic payment scheme credits, subsidy that they were getting previously. So I think it's a combination of using private finance, but I think we also need continued support through schemes like ELMS, but actually the regulatory infrastructure to transact, so having a UK soil carbon code, because using Verra or Gold Standard, these quite expensive, quite painstaking approaches on a very small farm, is very difficult.
Thank you. Nick, I know you've been successfully investing across the global south in a variety of countries in regenerative agriculture. It'd be great to hear a bit more about those and opportunities you see, as well as challenges you've encountered.
Yeah, and maybe I can just build off of your example, which I thought was very nice, because I think we've experienced in the last year something similar in terms of the growing business case behind regenerative agriculture. And I'll give an example of an investment we supported last year, which was into a larger farm where they were looking at about 5,000-6,000 hectares, where they wanted to do a mass transition on that side. But the reason it came about first and foremost was that they were seeing escalating fertilizer prices and inputs, and the business case just suddenly became much more important for them to reduce inputs and to look at technologies which were able to really target the herbicide and pesticide use that they were going through. Now, this is a larger farm, they have other sites. So for them, the immediate business case was there to start to look at ways in which they could improve soil structure, organic matter, productivity, or maintain productivity, while also lowering significantly their inputs. But in order for them to then scale it out across the rest of them, they need other incentive structures. And so now they're looking, and this is more anecdotal than them saying it's happening, but now they're looking at how can we integrate carbon as another part of that. So we've lowered the price on inputs. Maybe we can also find other opportunities to see that transition amongst carbon, because they've managed to make big capital investments. They've managed to really lower inputs, but now they need some longer term revenues to also come alongside that. The way we've personally, with the way our fund has been involved, is we've helped the financial sector to manage both the upfront risks of that. So we take on a portion of the risk, and if there's a default during that transition period, we will pay out. But also the other side of it is, with many of these projects, is the long-term nature of actually seeing those revenues come from it, because you will go through the transition period. And we also have helped the financial institution in this case to give a much longer tenor loan, which for the end client is great. They get a long tenor loan, better repayment terms, and for the bank, they're able to differentiate themselves in providing a different product to where they see opportunity now, which is this market change happening as well, with lots of more farmers coming forward to do it. So I think it's really interesting, your example, because I think we start to see a bit of those as well, where it's carbon is good, but also markets are changing and finance is changing to go alongside it as well.
Excellent. Helen, I don't know if you want to add in your reflections on...
Yeah, just wanted to, it's wanted to talk about the sort of two levels of what we're talking about. There's the on the farm, or in the rangeland, if you like, of what you do and how you make that transition, which is not necessarily easy. And there's actually been a lot of work that's shown that one of the biggest barriers for farmers changing their practices is more a sort of social issue. They don't want to be different to everyone else around them. And if everyone else around them and the way their fathers or grandfathers or grandmothers taught them to do things is the way that they want to do them. And so there's a lot of support that's needed on the ground, as well as the financial incentives. It's not just the financial incentives. So there's that piece of it, and there's some really fantastic work being done all over the world on how to really support farmers, whether it's grazing systems or row crops. So I think there's that element of it. I think at the global level, that what I think is particularly exciting, as well as the on-the-farm shifts that are happening, and where you actually see that the ground is it's bouncier and it's richer and the farm is more productive and more profitable, and that's fantastic. At the global level, this idea about business as usual not being possible, we have to start really sort of socialising that idea as just as much as at the farm we're socialising this transition to a regenerative approach, because it's just that the transformation of food systems, of fibre systems, sustainable fashion, nutrient security, food security is all going to be dependent on an agriculture that's resilient and long-term and sustainable, and it currently isn't, even though. And so, as Simi said, with the work that they've done, and the rangeland, most of the 40% of the world is grassland, and most of that's degraded. And we're losing soil at an alarming rate. And you've heard all the doom and gloom about how we are just not going to be able to produce food and fibre. We're losing diversity. We've lost in the last 100 years, I think, 90% of food crop diversity in the US. We only eat a few species. We could eat a lot more species. So there's a whole lot that's happening here that is all pointing to we've got to stop this, as was said, an extractive, degrading approach and move to a regenerative approach, bring back the biodiversity as well as the agrobiodiversity. So I think that recognition is starting to happen at a global level as well, and that this food system transformation, that we keep talking about, has to be rooted in also, literally and metaphorically, in transforming the way agriculture is more regenerative and restorative. So that's good, but I think that messaging has to keep coming through, that the risk of inaction is greater than the risk of action when it comes to transforming our agricultural systems. So I think, and I see it in the fashion world, where there's a lot of focus on regenerative fibres, and regenerative food and regenerative fibres go together. Wool comes from sheep. We eat sheep. We also use the wool, and so on and so forth. So that is that great interest that you cannot, as a corporate, meet your climate and nature goals and ambitions, and actual mandatory goals and ambitions as well, mandatory reporting on climate nature, if you don't look at your scope 3 and if you don't look at your agricultural production. So there's new awareness and pressures and information coming to help shift the system, but we've just sort of to keep that, which is why we're talking about it today, keep that messaging alive and well, that it is possible to do this transformation, and that there will be this funding that will come through to help support that.
I wanted to just pick up on the theme that was briefly mentioned on the size of farms. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I work with smallholder farmers in the Peruvian Amazon. And obviously they are a hugely important global demographic, but stand in stark contrast to the much larger farms with higher input levels of Europe and North America and so on. So it would be good if we could have some thoughts from the panel on how the size of farm affects the ability to adopt regenerative agriculture. Simi, I don't know if you could start us off with some thoughts on that.
Sure. I think I can add to that from my experience in the Government of India. So the Government of India classifies a farm into 3 categories. One, small farms, which is like under 2 hectares, and then 2 to 10 is marginal farms, and then 10 hectares and above are large farms. If you look at the total population of farmers, 82% are small and marginal farmers, which means they have land holdings less than 10 hectares, which is very tiny when compared to some of the big farms of North America or Latin America. So when we talk about regenerative agriculture practice that would work well for those farmers, the issues might be completely different from other parts of the world. We were talking to the state government of some of the hilly states about scaling up organic farming, and they said that in hilly areas where it rains a lot, it's naturally organic. They don't use fertilizers at all. They don't need fertilizers. So the problem for them is soil erosion. It's not about use of agrochemicals. So that's completely different. So those are the kind of issues which become important.
Nick, I know you've managed to successfully invest in some smallholder programs. What have been the kind of enabling factors that have enabled you to invest there?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's always been about having, we're tending to look at things at scale. So often when looking at the programs that we have done, and we hope we can do more, it's been about finding, first of all, a good project sponsor that's able to provide not just the training and capacity that's needed, but also the market offtake that goes with it, and hopefully even in some instances be a channel for financing. I mean, as many people probably who are developers in the room know, dealing with a single party and somebody who can really drive that project is quite clear. But I think also the business case for farmers needs to be there, and the support and value needs to be there from the market to recognize it as well. And this is just, again, anecdotal. We were in India several weeks ago and looking at a variety of different business cases, both on the technology side and also just purely on the business case side. And what's interesting is to see that some of the successful ones that we were looking at have been now more on the technological side, but also on the finance side. So on the technological side, the smallholder models that are working is where they've managed to agglomerate or provide lots of market information to farmers in a single way. And on the business side, where they've managed to find ways to lower costs or indeed provide improvements in productivity to farmers. For example, an organic off-taker that was working with farmers in the west of the country was also picking up the logistics costs, which made up something like 25% of the farmer's costs on a day-to-day. Just by actually driving to the farm, picking up the organics, they covered the cost that it took for the transition to organics for the farmers. So in other words, they sort of netted out. So farmers then saw the longer term benefit, but were able to go through the transition costs. So I think, when we look at it, it's definitely capacity of project sponsors, ways in which you can conglomerate, and technology is really improving that. Business cases as well to really improve it. And typically on business case, market access to drive that. And then I think there's just a softer thing, which is trust and capacity and ability to be actually able to engage with communities in a way that they, as Helen had said, they're not going to change overnight. They need to see something, others change. So I can tell you, but I'll tell everybody offline, we definitely have a couple of failures as well, but I won't introduce those.
I'm conscious we do want to allow a bit of time to open up for questions to the audience. So I've just got a quick few more questions to put to the panel first. Will, you touched on the increasing opportunity through carbon finance. It'd be great if, I know a lot of people in the room would be interested in just some overview thoughts on available carbon methodologies that can be dovetailed into regenerative agriculture. And how important you feel carbon finance will be moving forward in stimulating greater uptake of regen ag.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in soil organic carbon quantification, there's even more choice and complexity than we see in the wider market. So at the moment, there's half a dozen or more standards that you could feasibly certify soil organic carbon under, ranging from Fairr and Gold Standard to a lot of new standards under platforms like Regen Network, B Carbon. And they all have slightly different approaches. And, the decision is in part informed on what your route to market is, whether you're looking at a in-supply chain type sale. So, and I think there is a big opportunity around that, particularly when you're achieving a reduction in carbon on farm as well as sequestration, versus selling into, beyond value chain mitigation or classical offsetting. I think which choice you make on standards, there's also variance around issues that are the sort of core, critical carbon issues, such as additionality. So we were talking earlier about actually a lot of the barrier to scale is cultural inertia and persuading farmers to do something profoundly different from what they've done from the last several decades. And I think if you stick a very rigorous financial additionality test on that, it doesn't really work. I mean, it works in forest protection or creating new carbon sinks, planting mangroves, because that's your only income stream. I mean, here clearly, particularly on larger assets, the carbon revenue is going to be a very small proportion of overall. So I think actually that is an area where we need to have a bit more sophistication and insight on interpretation of additionality. Another example would be permanence. And clearly this market is going to increasingly be driven by durability of the ton of sequestered carbon you pay for. But how do you square that off against farmers that might be coming to the end of their sort of career and looking to transition or exit? Putting long-term covenants or restrictions on title has a negative impact on value. But equally, for farmers monetizing carbon, they've got to deliver the quid pro quo and subject themselves to some assurances. What we've taken in the asset that I mentioned specifically is a 10-year assurance around reversal. So there'll be a liability if there was a conscious reversal, for instance, active soil disturbance. I think those types of issues, there's a lot of variability within the standards, and I think the MRV piece is the other bit to watch out on, as we've seen, particularly in REDD+ type baselines and methodologies. The quantification of below ground biomass and organic matter is really complex. We don't have a historical data set to interpret, so the emerging kind of IP, as it were, is trying to mesh data through sampling with geospatial measurement, so doing infrared testing and correlate the two. So at the moment, I think different protocols allow you to operate entirely on a model basis. Others allow measure, remeasure, or a hybrid. I think we're very much of the opinion we want to measure and have some of that empiricism. But if you're doing one of these large landscape projects, there's such variability. You can stratify and measure, but it doesn't really necessarily get you so far. So there is a lot of complexity, but I do think the MRV piece is moving pretty quickly, so we'll enable more at scale.
I think it should be, just to pick up on the last point, it should be seen as an enabler. It's not the sort of the end, it's a means to an end. I mean, the carbon financing can help as one of the revenue streams through the transition. As you've said, I think it's a mistake if we think that. Of course, you're not saying it's the only one, but because the way the holistic system has to be set up, it's going to have multiple benefits, and carbon can be one of them. Biodiversity credits ultimately potentially could be another as you improve above ground biodiversity, and there may be an opportunity to really explore biodiversity credits in certain agricultural landscapes and certain farming practices. So that could be another revenue stream, but the big revenue stream is the commodity, what's produced itself. And from what I can see from the corporate side, there is increasingly a desire, a willingness to invest and encourage and engage with their producers so that they get that commodity product, raw material that addresses their own needs as in terms of biodiversity, in terms of nature, in terms of climate outcomes. So as a company says, I want to make sure that my scope 3 is really working for me, for everything that I have set out there as well. And so there is more and more interest along the supply chain to support those transitions. So there's that piece. So that means the actual raw material, the wool, the meat, the cotton, the cashmere becomes more valuable as well as it becomes more regenerative. We're not quite there yet, but that's the way we've got to really move as well. And because the agricultural subsidies will, according to the Global Biodiversity Framework and the signatories, 194 countries that signed it, they agreed to look at repurposing subsidies, 500 billion a year, of which much of that will be agricultural subsidies, repurpose that for biodiversity outcomes. So there's going to be these different, we'll see if that happens, hopefully it will, but there'll be these different forces that will come to play to help support this bigger transition.
I'd just like to add a little bit to the point made on quantification of carbon. So there are multiple shades to carbon, and I think it's very important for the investment community to understand that. when we talk of carbon, there's one that scope 3 emissions, CO2 equivalent. There is methane emissions, which are turned into CO2 equivalent terms. There are, nitrous oxide, which is converted into CO2 equivalent terms. So there are multiple colors to CO2, and it is important for us as we think about decarbonizing the value chain. We should understand that we are decarbonizing the entire, the shades of carbon, and ensuring that, the companies and, the financial institutions are reporting on those different shades of carbon. This is particularly important for the livestock sector because 80% of the total emissions of any livestock company comes from scope 3 emissions. Now, barely anyone reports scope 3 emissions. Even within scope 3 emissions, there are flag emissions, which are emissions from the forestry and land use and agriculture sector, and there are the non-flag emissions, which are emissions from the energy sector. So if you look at one of the biggest livestock company in Brazil, it said that it has set a target for decarbonizing scope 3 emissions. But there was lack of clarity on whether it's flag emissions or non-flag emissions. Non-flag emissions must be very tiny for that big company because it barely, compared to the other emissions. But flag emissions, which are like livestock methane emissions, are huge. So it's important that the company sets target for flag scope 3 emissions. So those kind of granularities are also very important as we look at quantification of carbon and adding a monetary value to carbon.
Yeah, I mean, I would love it if corporates invested into their supply chain and drive the decarbonisation. But what I don't want to happen is corporates to put in the small print, we're going to take all the carbon benefit without making that investment. So part of our signalling function is to create a fair price or do market discovery on carbon so that farmers aren't shortchanged.
Yes. Okay, on that note, we did have more questions. We could talk about this for much longer, but we would like to give the audience a chance to ask any questions. Have we got any? No. I think they're bringing a mic over to you.
Hi there, thank you. I'm Peter, and I'm an impact investor, much to skew to forestry, but looking much into regen ag. And as a member of Tonic, we've did a recently field expedition to Portugal to a couple of farmers in a co-op of where they try regen ag without any chemicals, and even not even with heavy machinery. And the outcome is more or less what you said. Is they have better productivity, less cost. But my question now, one thing that stunned me was, not stunned me, but I didn't hear it so far, the food quality. The nutritional scientists, they told us then that it's much higher nutritional value that we get as a consumer. I could taste it myself, but they also had lab reports showing, for instance, the olive oil had medicinal quality. So that's something I lack in this discussion right now, that you talk about the food quality.
Yeah. Nutrition security. So yeah, absolutely. Through regen. Because the soil is what is going into those plants and the animals, and that's what's creating that nutrition and micronutrition that we've lost so much of, that if we bring the soil functionality back, that can go into the food that we eat. And it does get lost in the discussion, and given nutrition security is such an issue, not just food security, but nutrition as well, we should be bringing that out more, you're right, as a value for regen approaches.
Yeah, definitely. Any other questions before we close?
Hi, thank you. Agnieszka, Carbon Markets at Equino. I think it's really exciting, the point where we are with regen agriculture and how much momentum is building, and the potential is huge. But I wonder what your opinion is, given all the different interests in that area currently between, the different insetting programs, various government incentives that are coming up more and more in the US, but not only, also different schemes where, farmers get rewarded by being able to sell products at higher prices if they can demonstrate that they've been, lower carbon intensity. How attractive, how competitive can offsetting programs and the VCM be in terms of attracting farmers and incentivizing them versus some of the other channels?
I think that's a really interesting question. Yes, so just to have a bit of facilitator privilege here. Yesterday, I mentioned I asked a question to the agroforestry panel, actually, about how you would incentivize investment and adoption of agroforestry to more marginalized subsistence farmers. And I think one of the points that came out of that panel was obviously the insetting opportunity is with those larger farms and with smallholders that are linked into the global supply chains, which is actually a lot of what we've talked about today on the panel. But actually, there's a whole other world of smallholders who are subsistence, who are much more marginalized, who are actually going to feel the impacts of climate change terribly. And obviously, they haven't got access to the insetting market. But let me turn over to the panel as well to give their reflections on that question.
I'll let Will take this one.
Well, I mean, as I said before, I mean, the internal decarbonisation ranks higher in the, mitigation hierarchy, so that's always preferred. In terms of, with a market hat on, what's the price signal between cost, an internal carbon price, which very few companies have, and the signal in the market from, offsetting? And is there kind of a difference there? I mean, they are perhaps a slightly different species of credit, because for the in-supply chain claim, having the avoidance or the reduction in the footprint on farm probably has more value than, particularly as we move towards more of a removals market. And there's obviously a lot of regulatory guidance, particularly in the EU, coming out. I think, at the moment, as an investor, I would want to try and preserve fungibility to access both routes. Where this goes towards compliance, I don't think you can have the sort of double counting, and perhaps implicit in your question, if you're selling your product at a premium price because it's lower carbon, you can't monetize that carbon somewhere else. So I think that's a risk that needs to be managed. Personally, I think it's this, challenge. I don't see sort of agriculture suddenly going into compliance markets because it's still a very significant source of emissions. So I think it kind of, there's a transition period to get its own carbon down before you start thinking about additional support from compliance.
Okay, I've got like the big zero flashing up at us here, so I think we are out of time. Thank you to the excellent comments from the panel, and thank you, audience, for listening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.